I remember reading a book or looking at a book in 1996 called The End of Science. The writer, John Horgan, was arguing that the really big problems in science, or very many of them, had been solved. And the remaining big problems, like why do we exist at all, why does anything exist, where does consciousness come from, would likely never be solved. So science was at an end. I found this very puzzling. At the time I was thinking about and writing about technology. So Horgan's book caused me to think a lot. And what I want to talk about this morning with regard to where science is heading is to look at it from the point of view of technology, not just from the point of view of thought. Science proceeds, and we're trying to look here 20, 30, 50 years ahead, and science proceeds in many ways. Theoretically, I'm a theoretician, proceeds by thinking, proceeds by observing. But more than anything else, I would maintain science proceeds by its technologies, by its instruments, if you prefer, and its methods, and the methods that are tied to those instruments. I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, preparing this talk, and I thought, well, okay, I'll come up fairly randomly with 5 different or 6 different families of technology. One is very obvious, the optical telescope around 1610 and thereafter, microscope 50 years later, and thereafter, particle accelerators. These are sort of random families of technology all through the 20th century and into our time. X-ray crystallography getting really going in the 1930s and 40s. Radio astronomy from the 1930s, 40s on. And genomic methods certainly starting 1953, but really getting going in the 60s, 70s, and enjoying a real heyday at the moment. What's common? You might have your own list. I've probably omitted at least a dozen really important families of technology. And these technologies or instruments and the methods that go with them keep improving. There's nothing static. And they improve over decades and sometimes over centuries. What I want to point out is each of these technologies that I've mentioned has opened up a new world for us. When Galileo pointed his telescope, you can see the telescope, by the way, in the Vatican. I just stood in front of it, marveling at the thing in far better condition than I had expected. Maybe it had been restored, renewed, and like George Washington's axe, had been greatly renewed. The telescope showed Galileo something really important, that Venus had phases, which meant to Galileo that Venus was circling the sun, which was an immense idea at the time, and that the moon was very imperfect. It wasn't a perfect body by any means. It had mountains, craters, and things like that. Above all, that Jupiter had moons circling it. So the Earth wasn't the center, which Galileo probably knew from studying Copernicus. But this opened a whole new world, that the Earth wasn't the center of things and that there were amazing things going on in the cosmos. I could take any of these methods, X-ray crystallography. Not only did it allow scientists to look into crystals, but also into complicated polymers, DNA itself, and that opened the world to molecular biology, to how genetics was fundamentally organized, to the work of Brenner, Crick, and others on the code, the genetic code, opened up the entire world of molecular biology. Radio astronomy gave us quasars, pulsars, radio galaxies, and many, many other things that Martin Rees would be extraordinarily familiar with. So it's not just that scientists or engineers come up with these instruments. These instruments are kind of noticed. They derive each one of them from phenomena themselves in nature, from radio phenomena, from optical phenomena, and they reveal worlds to us that constitute the challenges of the times. It's a real challenge if you're Galileo. You say, oh my God, there's so much going on out there. I can even see it through my 8 times magnification telescope. What on earth is this? And that's a challenge, and it may take Galileo and his successors decades and even centuries to start to work out. So the question then I want to put this morning is there a new technology or a set of new technologies at the moment, besides all the ones that we're familiar with, the ones I've mentioned? Naturally, the one to point to is computation. And a naive view of computation, I work in Silicon Valley, I'm at Xerox PARC, have been there for a long time, Santa Fe Institute. So we do an awful lot of computation. And you would sort of think, well, we're getting somewhere probably because Moore's law operates. There's so much more computational power available. There's more storage power available. There's more data available. So naturally, things are moving ahead. I think it's more subtle than that, and that's what I want to point out here, because I think this starts to open up what's really going on. It's not really computation that counts. Of course you need the hardware. It's actually the algorithms that are making the difference. And it's not just algorithms that count. It's a rather subtle interplay between technology or instruments themselves and algorithms. So if you, for example, you could take certain optical instruments, sense, there might be hundreds of mirrors in a given modern telescope, each of them independent, each of them you can point at something independently. You sense these instruments, you do an awful lot of real-time computation, and they can compensate for instantaneously for refractive changes in the atmosphere. So what you see again and again is a really interesting combination of instruments themselves looking at something in nature, digital versions of those instruments being brought back, algorithms somehow adjusting or magnifying those instruments in real time, and then we get some sort of feedback, and the whole thing is orchestrated as a whole and is far more than the original parts. One way to think about this is that if you have algorithms, those algorithms can do much more than calculation. They can adjust, they can adapt, they can count, they can store, they can control, they can direct, they can recognize, they can compare, they can amplify, etc. So what's really happened if you take the scientific instruments themselves, the hardware, and these algorithms, notice that all the descriptors I've used are all verbs. Store, recognize, etc. We have essentially invented for ourselves a new programming language in which we can take hardware instruments, put them together with these verbs, amplify this, store that, retrieve this, sort this, and we get extraordinarily powerful results. Not quite computers, not quite something like the Internet of Things, but new instruments that are adjusting themselves in real time. Does it make a difference? I want to quote some figures from Douglas Robertson, who was here in March. Robertson says, optical telescopes made a difference to what we could see with our naked eye, originally by about a factor of 60. With Mount Palomar, etc., that goes up to about 2 orders of magnitude, somewhere between 100 and 1,000. Digital methods, and it depends on what you count as a digital method, obviously. Digital methods, you think, well, that might add 10%, it might add 20% to the resolution of optical telescopes. No, it doesn't. It adds a further 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. So the computer, if you want, or algorithms, have added more to what we can see in the heavens, or what we can resolve and thereby see, than original telescopes have optically. And you could go across one field after another and say largely the same thing. What can we see with X-rays? Quite a bit. What can we see with computerized X-rays? Things like computerized tomography or CT scanning. Quite a lot more than we can see in 3 dimensions. What can we see with magnetic resonance, nuclear magnetic resonance? Not very much, but what can we see with computation allied to nuclear magnetic resonance, MRIs? A huge amount, and we can see soft tissues. So I could go through field after field after field. And the story is the same. We are seeing new worlds. We have enhanced understanding. And with the computer, and this is where my work and many others here, and a lot of your work would come in, we can kind of probe, we can sit in a little capsule if we want, and probe these new spaces. The spaces might be quite theoretical. Mathematicians of old were able to do a lot of calculations, and they say, okay, someone like Poincaré, a bit over 100 years ago, could do a lot of calculations by hand and figure out, well, this might be happening, that might be happening. But it's been routine for 20 or 30 years to use computers and see far more than Poincaré himself could have seen. So the computer or computation, or better said, algorithms, are to the human mind what telescopes are to the eye. They're expanding the range of the human mind. And now, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this in the next few days, we have artificial intelligence, which is expanding things yet further. So the challenge is, what are we going to see with all of that? One of the things we're seeing, and I want to come back to theory here, a lot of science, at least the kind of sciences I've been involved in Santa Fe and before that, been looking at how systems unfold over time. And the kinds of models, when I was trained, not so many eons ago, certainly not 2 billion years ago, but 3-4 decades ago, the kinds of systems I was looking at were always, or trained to look at, were always linear. Generally speaking, they were in some form of equilibrium. They were somehow continuous. They operated on continuous manifolds. And you could picture them as little ball bearings, say, running down some kind of manifold and maybe reacting to outside stimuli. What computation has allowed us to do is to reverse those 4 things. So those 4 properties are valid, but they give you a world that's rather small. So we're starting to look at nonlinear systems, non-continuous ones, in other words, discrete systems, non-equilibrium systems, and systems that react to their own internal state and how those changes in internal state play out over time in some larger sphere. I was brought up to believe that linear equilibrium systems, continuous ones, were the entire world, and then were tiny little anomalies outside that. What we're starting to realize, and this is thanks to being able to compute our way to looking at many more systems is that most systems in nature are nonlinear, they're non-continuous, they're perpetually not in equilibrium, and they're reacting to their own patterns. And this is opening up new worlds. I think this is a profound challenge. Stanislas Ulam in Los Alamos once said, non-linear systems are to linear ones as non-elephants are to elephants. There's a lot of world of non-elephants, and we simply don't know it in what we're doing in science. We're starting to explore our way into these completely new worlds. Those new worlds don't look mechanistic, amazingly. They look organic, and they look messy, but a sort of messiness we're at home with. And they're not super well ordered, and they look alive. I think this is the main challenge that we're facing, exploring all this.